Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. The Beaumont mansion breathed silence that night. Thick, almost solid silence that seemed to press against the Victorian wallpapered walls and fill every corner of the endless hallways. Candles in silver candelabras flickered, casting dancing shadows that climbed the marble staircases like ghosts of unspoken expectations. The air smelled of white lilies, hundreds of them brought, especially for the wedding, mingled with the woody aroma of expensive cigars and the floral perfume that still clung to Elena's wedding dress. She stood before the tall mirror in the bridal suite, watching her own reflection as if looking at a stranger. The ivory silk dress still embraced her body, heavy with meanings she hadn't chosen to carry. Her fingers trembled as she unbuttoned one by one the small pearl buttons down the back. Each movement was slow, hesitant, as if undoing the dress would also dismantle the last protection she still had. On the other side of the carved mahogany double doors, Julian Beaumont waited. She could feel his presence. Intense, magnetic, impossible to ignore. They had married just 6 hours earlier in a grand ceremony that brought together two of the most influential families on the East Coast. But between them, between Elena Rose Harlan and Julian Beaumont, there was only unfamiliarity and fear. She knew his reputation. Everyone did. Julian was the type of man people whispered about in tea rooms and formal dinners. Intense, unpredictable, obsessed with his passions, whether they were sculpture, metalwork, or, as some sharper tongues claimed, women. There were stories about his explosive temper, about how he hammered metal in the forge through entire nights when something disturbed him, about how his dark eyes could burn through a person, reading secrets she didn't even know she was keeping. And now Elena was his wife. The door opened with a soft click. She turned abruptly, her heart racing against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage too small. Julian entered, closing the door behind him with a calm that contrasted brutally with the chaos she felt inside. He had removed his jacket, his loosened tie hanging slack around the collar of his white shirt. The sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked by small scars, reminders of years working with fire and metal. Their eyes met, dark brown against light green, storm against spring. "Elena," he said, and there was something in the way he pronounced her name, slow, almost reverent, that made her skin prickle. It wasn't just a word. It was a question, a silent investigation. She stepped back half a pace, the dress still partially buttoned, her bare shoulders exposed to the soft candlelight. "Julian," her voice failed. How to explain, how to put into words the fear of giving herself to a stranger, no matter how many vows had been exchanged before an altar. He moved closer, not quickly. Nothing about his movements was rushed. Each step was measured, controlled, as if he were acutely aware of the effect he had. His scent arrived first leather, something slightly metallic mixed with sandalwood, and a warm note that was uniquely his, masculine, unsettling. "How you're trembling," Julian observed, stopping just inches from her, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, far enough not to completely invade her space. "I can't," Elena whispered. And then the words began to pour out, breaking the dam she had built throughout the day. "I can't just give myself like this." Not without her eyes filled with tears she desperately tried to hold back. "Not without love, Julian. I know this is an arrangement. I know our families expected this. But I can't do this without feeling something real." The silence that followed was absolute. She expected anger. She expected frustration, maybe even contempt. What would Julian Beaumont do with a wife who rejected him on their very wedding night? Instead, he raised his hand slowly, so slowly that she had all the time in the world to pull away if she wanted. His fingers, calloused and strong, gently touched her chin, tilting her face up until she had no choice but to look into his eyes. "I'm not going to rush you," Julian said, his voice low, rough, carrying something she couldn't name. "We'll take it." Slowly, his thumb slid along the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was almost a promise. His eyes studied her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead paralyzed her. There was something there, something fierce, yes, but also restrained, controlled. He leaned in slowly. His face approached hers millimeter by millimeter until she could count every dark lash, see the small scar near his left eyebrow, feel the warmth of his breath against her lips. He didn't kiss her. He just hovered there, so close that their lips almost touched, so close that the entire world narrowed to that minimal space between them. Despacito, he murmured. The Spanish word sounding like a vow, a seduction, a promise wrapped in danger. Slowly, Elena. I'll wait for you to want this as much as I do. Her breath caught. She could feel every beat of her own heart echoing in her ears. The heat between them was almost unbearable. Not just physical, but emotional, visceral, as if the air were charged with electricity waiting to be released. And then he stepped back. He moved away from her with the same deliberate slowness with which he had approached, giving her space to breathe, to think, to exist, without his overwhelming presence. Sleep, Julian said, his voice still rough. I'll take the guest room tonight. You don't have to, she began, but he was already turning. I do, he interrupted, looking over his shoulder with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because if I stay here, Elena, I might not be able to keep my promise. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Elena stood alone in the bridal suite. Her heart still beating erratically, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. She brought her fingers to her lips, to the place where his breath had brushed against hers, and for the first time that impossible night, she felt something beyond fear. She felt curiosity, desire, and the burning question that would accompany her until dawn. Who really was Julian Beaumont? The days following the wedding night were marked by a strange dance, two bodies orbiting each other without ever fully touching, like planets caught in each other's gravity, but maintaining enough distance not to collide. Elena found refuge in the old greenhouse at the back of the Beaumont property. It was a place forgotten by time, with glass panes fogged by humidity and a dark green iron structure corroded in spots. No one came here anymore. The plants had been abandoned years ago since Julian's grandmother's death, and most had either wilted or grown wild without direction. But for Elena, this place was perfect. She spent her mornings on her knees in the damp soil, fingers dirty with compost, the rich, earthy smell filling her lungs with each breath. There was something deeply comforting about caring for something alive, about seeing green shoots emerging from seeds planted with hope. Here she had control. Here she could make something grow. Orchids were her particular passion, delicate, demanding flowers that bloomed only under specific conditions. The right temperature, precise humidity, filtered light in exact measure. She had brought her small collection from her parents' house and now arranged them carefully on wooden shelves she had cleaned and repaired herself. Each pot had a name, a story. The pink phalaenopsis her grandmother had given her at 13, the purple cattleya she had cultivated from a tiny seedling, the paphiopedilum that refused to bloom no matter how many different techniques she tried. You understand, don't you? She murmured to the flowers as she misted their leaves. Sometimes we're not ready to open. Sometimes we need more time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the property, Julian inhabited a completely different world. His studio was in the converted old stable, a tall, spacious room with exposed wooden beams on the ceiling, and enormous windows that let in northern light. The smell there was of heated metal, fire, and sweat. The walls were covered with tools, hammers of all sizes, tongs, files, chisels. In the center, the forge glowed like a beating heart, incandescent coal radiating heat that made the air shimmer. Julian worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession, hours and hours hammering metal against anvil, the muscles in his shoulders and arms flexing under his sweat-soaked shirt. Bang, bang, bang. The rhythmic sound echoed across the property, a constant pulse that Elena could hear even inside the greenhouse. It was as if he were hammering something out of himself, frustration, desire, confusion, transforming raw emotions into elegant forms of iron and steel. He created abstract sculptures that somehow captured movement and emotion, metal spirals that seemed to dance, iron flowers so delicate it was hard to believe they had been forged in fire, human figures contorted in poses that suggested both pain and ecstasy. You're thinking too much, said Lucas, his assistant and only close friend, watching Julian hammer the same piece for the 5th time. Just talk to her. And say what? Julian replied without stopping his work, sparks flying each time the hammer met the metal. Sorry, I married you for a business deal. Sorry, I want you so badly that I can't sleep at night. Sorry that every time I close my eyes, I see your face. Lucas just shook his head and returned to his own work. It was at night that the real tension happened. The Beaumont mansion had long, silent hallways, marble floors that amplified every sound. Elena had learned Julian's schedule. When he returned from the studio, when he showered, When he went to the kitchen looking for something to eat because he had completely forgotten about dinner, she tried to avoid him. She really did. But it was as if their bodies were tuned to a frequency neither of them controlled. One night, she was leaving her room exactly as he was coming up the stairs. Their eyes met in the dimly lit hallway. Neither said anything. He wore only sweatpants, his bare chest still slightly damp from the shower, dark hair tousled. She wore a blue silk robe, her hair loose falling over her shoulders. The moment stretched. 2 seconds. 3. 5. An eternity condensed in a look that said everything their mouths refused to speak. Then he walked past her so close that his shoulder brushed hers. An accidental touch that sent waves of heat through her body like electricity. She heard his breathing change, saw his fists clenched tightly at his sides as if he were fighting the impulse to turn around. And what she didn't know, didn't want to know. Not yet. Another night, he found her in the library. Elena was curled up in a leather armchair near the fireplace, lost in a book about orchid hybridization. She didn't hear when he entered, didn't notice his presence until he spoke. "You're still awake." She startled, the book nearly slipping from her hands. Julian was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. Watching her with that intensity, she still didn't know how to interpret. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, marking her page and closing the book. "And you?" "I never sleep well," he replied, entering the library and pouring himself whiskey from a crystal decanter. He raised the bottle toward her, offering. She shook her head. He sat in the opposite armchair, separated from her only by the coffee table, too close, too far. The fireplace crackled between them, casting shadows that danced across his face, making him even more enigmatic. "What are you reading?" Julian asked, nodding toward the book. "Cross-pollination technique," Elena replied. And then, because the silence was becoming too heavy, "I'm trying to create a hybrid, an orchid that combines the hardiness of one species with the beauty of another. Forcing two different things to become one," he observed, a half-smile touching his lips. "Sounds familiar." She felt the blush rise up her neck. "It's not about forcing, it's about finding compatibility, creating something new that preserves the best of both. And if they reject each other?" he asked, his eyes fixed on hers. They weren't talking about flowers anymore. "Then I try again," she answered softly, "with patience, with care until it works." The air between them became charged. Julian took a long sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the pulse in her neck where she knew he was looking. "Patience," he repeated, the word coming out rough. "I'm trying, Elena, but you have no idea how hard it is." "I know," she whispered, and realized it was true. She saw it in the tense lines of his body, in the way his fingers gripped the crystal glass, saw it in the way he looked at her, as if she were both the most precious and most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. He stood abruptly. "I should go, Julian." She didn't know what she was going to say, didn't know if she should ask him to stay or thank him for leaving. But as he passed her chair, his hand brushed her shoulder just for a second, just the lightest of touches. But it was enough to ignite every nerve in her body. The door closed behind him, and Elena was left alone with the dying fire and the growing certainty that this careful distance they maintained from each other couldn't last forever. Something between them was growing slow, inevitable, like an orchid that had finally found the right conditions to bloom. It was during a quiet breakfast 3 weeks after the wedding that everything began to change. Elena sat at the long dining room table, the same one where dozens of Beaumonts had taken their meals over generations. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the fine porcelain and polished silverware. She nibbled at a piece of toast without much interest, her eyes scanning the pages of an auction catalog that had arrived in the mail. Julian entered, hair still damp from his shower, wearing a white linen shirt and dark trousers. He had started having breakfast with her in recent weeks, a silent habit neither commented on, but both seemed to value. These were the only moments of the day when they shared the same space without the dangerous electricity that charged their nighttime encounters. "Good morning," he murmured, pouring himself coffee from the silver pot. "Good morning," she replied, turning a page of the catalog. He sat in the chair beside her, not at the opposite end of the table, as would be expected, but close enough that she could smell his aftershave. Something citrus mixed with cedar. "What's that?" Julian asked, nodding toward the catalog with his cup. "A rare book auction in London," Elena explained, a touch of enthusiasm entering her voice for the first time. "There are some incredible first editions. An original Darwin. An order." Her fingers slid over a specific image, caressing it almost reverently. And this Julian leaned in to see better, so close that his shoulder touched hers. She didn't pull away. The genus Orchidaceae, a complete study. He read aloud, What's special about it? Elena's eyes lit up. It's the definitive work on orchids from the 19th century. The author, Dr. Edmund Whitmore, spent 30 years traveling the world, documenting every species he found. There are hand-drawn botanical illustrations, detailed habitat descriptions. It's practically a Bible for anyone who works seriously with orchids. She sighed, closing the catalog. I've been looking for a copy for years, but it's extremely rare. Only 200 copies were printed, and most are in museums or private collections. Why don't you bid on it? Julian asked, studying her face with that intensity she was beginning to recognize, as if he were memorizing every detail, every expression. Elena gave a short laugh. Did you see the starting bid? £15,000, and it'll go much higher. I can't justify spending that much on a book. Even if it is. She stopped, biting her lower lip. It's just a dream anyway. Julian said nothing, just took a sip of coffee, but Elena felt his gaze linger on her for a few more seconds before he returned to his own plate. The conversation shifted to other trivial subjects: the weather, his plans for the day in the studio. He mentioned that some of the greenhouses needed repairs. It was a familiar dance now, this careful exchange of words that never went too deep, that never touched the true abyss of unspoken things that existed between them. 3 weeks passed. Elena completely forgot about the conversation about the book. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the delivery arrived. Elena was in the greenhouse as always, transplanting a particularly delicate Vanda orchid, when she heard the distant doorbell of the mansion. She didn't think much of it. Mail and deliveries arrived constantly for the Beaumonts. But then, Mrs. Ellis, the silver-haired housekeeper who ran the house with military efficiency, appeared at the greenhouse door with a peculiar expression on her face. Mrs. Beaumont, she said, and Elena, still startled every time she heard that name applied to her. There's a package for you. It arrived from England, registered and insured. She paused meaningfully. It appears to be something valuable. Elena frowned, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron as she followed Mrs. Ellis back to the mansion. She hadn't ordered anything from England. Maybe it was something from her mother, some belated wedding gift. The box was in the living room, large and rectangular, wrapped in brown paper and covered with stamps and customs labels. Her name was written in black ink, Mrs. Elena Beaumont. With trembling hands and not understanding why, she began to open the package, layers of tissue paper, bubble wrap, and then finally emerging like an archaeological treasure being unearthed. Oh my God, Elena whispered, her hands flying to cover her mouth. It was the book, the genus Orchidaceae. A complete study. The dark green leather binding was surprisingly well preserved, the gilt edges still gleaming. She opened it reverently, the smell of ancient pages and century-old ink rising to meet her. The illustrations were even more breathtaking in person. Vibrant watercolors showing orchids in extraordinary detail, every stamen, every petal, every root rendered with scientific precision and artistic beauty. Her hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped the book. Tears began streaming down her face, unbidden, blurring her vision. Mrs. Beaumont? Mrs. Ellis asked, concerned. Are you all right? Elena couldn't speak. There was a small card between the pages. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and read the words written in strong, decisive handwriting she recognized immediately. For the woman who understands that some things can't be forced, they just need the right conditions to bloom. Jay, how did he? Elena began, but her voice failed. How did he get this? It was then that she heard footsteps on the stairs. She turned to see Julian coming down, still wearing his work clothes from the studio, jeans speckled with soot, a gray t-shirt clinging to his body with sweat. He stopped on the last step when their eyes met, his expression cautious, almost vulnerable. How did you even? Elena whispered, holding the book against her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Julian descended the last step, approaching slowly. I listen, he said simply, his dark eyes fixed on hers. When you talk about the things you love, your whole face changes. Your eyes light up. Your voice gets softer. I wanted. He stopped, running his hand through his hair in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as nervousness. I wanted to see that look directed at something I could give you. Julian, this must have cost a fortune, she began, but he shook his head. Money doesn't matter. You matter. He took another step. They were only inches apart now. I know this marriage didn't start the way either of us wanted. I know you're scared of me. Of this. Of us. But Elena, his hand rose, hesitant, before gently touching her face, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek. I want you to be happy here. Even if we never, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elena looked at him, really looked for the first time since the wedding. She saw beyond the reputation, beyond the intense and unpredictable man everyone described. She saw someone who had paid attention to a casual conversation over breakfast, someone who had gone to the trouble of tracking down a rare book across continents, someone who understood that the most meaningful gestures weren't the grand ones, but the thoughtful ones, someone who saw her, truly saw her. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, and then, without thinking too much, without weighing consequences, she leaned in and pressed her lips against his cheek, a soft, chaste kiss that lasted only a second, but seemed to shift the gravity of everything between them. When she pulled back, she saw the expression on Julian's face, surprise, hope, and something more intense, more profound, that made her heart race. Read it, he said, his voice rough, and then maybe tell me about your favorite species. I want to understand what you see in them. Elena nodded, unable to form words. Watching him climb the stairs back to his room, she held the book against her chest, feeling the weight of it, the meaning of it, and knew that something fundamental had shifted. Julian Beaumont wasn't the man she thought he was, and she was beginning to want to discover who he really was. Lillian Beaumont's arrival was announced not by phone call or advance warning, but by the unmistakable sound of a black Bentley's tires crushing the gravel of the circular driveway. Elena was in the greenhouse when she heard it, her fingers buried in damp soil as she repotted a phalaenopsis that had finally developed roots healthy enough for a larger pot. She didn't think much of it initially. The Beaumont property received occasional visitors, Julian's business partners, suppliers for the studio, distant family members, but then Mrs. Ellis appeared at the greenhouse door, her habitually serene face marked with tense lines of concern. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, and there was a tone of warning in her voice. "Your mother-in-law has arrived, Mrs. Lillian Beaumont. She's waiting in the living room." Elena felt her stomach clench. She had met Lillian briefly during the wedding. A tall, elegant woman in her 60s, with blonde hair perfectly arranged in a French twist, impeccable designer clothes, and a look that seemed to evaluate and find fault in everything it saw. The matriarch of the Beaumont family, the woman who had arranged the marriage between Elena and Julian, as if negotiating a corporate merger. "I'll clean up first," Elena said, looking at her dirty hands and soil-stained apron. "She said it was urgent," Mrs. Ellis replied with a sympathetic look, "said to get you immediately." Elena swallowed hard and nodded, wiping her hands as best she could on a damp cloth before following Mrs. Ellis back to the mansion. Each step felt too heavy, as if she were walking toward an execution. Lillian Beaumont stood in the center of the living room, perfectly composed in a beige Chanel suit, examining a bronze sculpture on the mantel, as if evaluating its market value. She turned when Elena entered, and her gaze swept over the younger woman from head to toe, registering the hair pulled into a messy bun, the simple clothes, the dirt still visible under her nails. "Elena," she said, the name sounding like a disappointment. "How rustic you look, Mrs. Beaumont," Elena replied, forcing politeness into her voice. "I didn't know you were coming today. If you had warned me, would you have hidden in your little greenhouse?" Lillian interrupted, sitting gracefully in an armchair as if it were a throne. "That's all I hear about from the staff. That you spend every waking hour playing with flowers while my son works himself to exhaustion in that studio." Elena felt the flush rise up her neck, but kept her voice steady. "I'm not playing. I cultivate rare orchids. Some of them I didn't come here to discuss your hobbies." Lillian cut in again, her tone sharp as broken glass. She crossed her legs, her hands perfectly folded over her knee. "I came to discuss your duties as Mrs. Julian Beaumont." "My duties?" "Yes, your duties." Lillian tilted her head, studying Elena with cold, calculating eyes. "You've been married for almost 2 months now." 2 months, Elena, and yet I hear from certain sources that you and Julian still maintain separate bedrooms, that there hasn't been any consummation of this union." Elena's blood ran cold. "With all due respect, Mrs. Beaumont, that's not it's absolutely my concern." Lillian stood, her voice growing harder. "Do you think I arranged this marriage for romance, for love?" She laughed, a humorless sound. "I arranged it because the Beaumont line needs to continue. We need an heir, Your job, dear girl, is to provide one. My job, Elena repeated, anger beginning to replace the initial shock. I'm not a brood mare. No, Lillian agreed coldly. You're a Beaumont wife, which comes with expectations. My son is 32 years old. He needs a family. He needs children to carry on the legacy that 6 generations built. And you, she stepped closer. Each word punctuated like a dagger. You need to stop being such a frightened little virgin and fulfill your obligations. Tears stung Elena's eyes, but she held them back fiercely. You have no right. I have every right. Lillian interrupted. I'm the one who saved your family from bankruptcy, the one who paid your father's debts, the one who made sure your mother could keep her precious social standing. You owe the Beaumonts everything, Elena, everything. And what we're asking in return is so simple, so natural. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Go to my son's bed, seduce him if you must, and get pregnant. We need a Beaumont heir. The sooner the better. Get out. The voice came from the doorway, deep, lethal, carrying a fury so controlled it was more frightening than any shout. Julian stood in the threshold, still wearing his studio clothes, dark jeans, and a black t-shirt stained with soot. His hair was disheveled, probably from running his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his eyes that made Lillian take a step back, dark eyes burning with an intensity Elena had never seen before. Julian, Lillian began, recovering her composure. I was just having a conversation with your wife about treating her like property. Julian entered the room, and there was something predatory in his movements. He positioned himself between Elena and his mother, a physical shield. About humiliating her. About reducing our marriage to what? A breeding contract. Don't be dramatic, Lillian replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm simply stating facts. The Beaumont family needs. The Beaumont family, Julian interrupted, his voice low and dangerous, doesn't need anything. You need you, and your obsession with legacy and heirs and maintaining appearances. He took another step closer to his mother, and Lillian instinctively backed away. But let me make something very clear, Mother. Elena and I are getting to know each other. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Slowly, the word was spoken with such intention, such weight, that Lillian blinked, momentarily speechless. And when, if we decide to have children, it will be our decision. Our choice. Not on your timeline. Not to satisfy your ridiculous expectations. Julian crossed his arms, his posture absolutely unyielding. Now get out of my house. Your house? Lillian found her voice again, though it was trembling slightly. This is the Beaumont estate. I lived here and now it's mine. Julian cut her off. Mine and Elena's. And you're not welcome here unless you can treat my wife with the respect she deserves. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could see the vein pulsing in Lillian's temple, could feel the tension radiating from Julian in almost palpable waves. Lillian grabbed her Hermes bag from the side table, her movement stiff with contained anger. You'll regret this, she said quietly, but there was no real conviction in her voice. Both of you. The only thing I regret, Julian replied, is not protecting Elena from you sooner. Lillian left, her high heels echoing against the marble like gunshots. The front door closed with enough force to make the paintings on the walls tremble. And then there was only silence. Julian remained with his back to Elena for a long moment, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She could see his breathing, deep, controlled, as if he were fighting to calm the storm inside him. Julian, she said softly. He turned, and the expression on his face made her heart squeeze. There was anger there still, yes, but also something more vulnerable. Concern, even fear. How much did you hear? She asked. Enough. His jaw tightened. Too much. Elena took a step toward him, closing the distance they always maintained. Thank you, she whispered, for defending me. You shouldn't have to be defended, Julian replied, his voice rough. Not in your own home. Not from my own mother. He ran his hands over his face, looking suddenly exhausted. I'm sorry, Elena, for her. For this whole situation. For everything. It's not your fault, is it? He laughed. A bitter sound. I agreed to this marriage. I let my mother orchestrate everything. I turned you into... He didn't finish the sentence, shaking his head. Elena reached out, hesitant, before gently touching his arm. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact beyond that kiss on the cheek. You also stood up for me. You told her that we're getting to know each other." She paused, a small smile touching her lips. Slowly, Julian's eyes met hers, and she saw something soften in them, something warm and intense and completely focused on her. "Yeah," he said quietly, slowly, "because that's what you need. And what you need," his hand covered hers, still resting on his arm, "is more important than what anyone else wants, including me." Their touch, skin against skin, warmth against warmth, lasted only a few seconds before Elena pulled away, but it was enough to shift something between them. When she returned to the greenhouse later, her hands were still trembling, but not from humiliation nor fear, from something completely different. 3 days after the confrontation with Lillian, Julian appeared at the greenhouse for the first time. Elena was on her knees on a rubber mat, leaning over a low workbench where she had spread out gardening tools, terracotta pots, and a particularly stubborn cattleya that refused to adapt to its new substrate. Her hands worked with delicate precision, removing dead roots, examining each part of the plant like a surgeon studying a patient. She didn't hear the greenhouse door open, didn't notice his presence until his shadow fell across the workbench, blocking the filtered light coming through the fogged glass. "You're completely absorbed," Julian said, his voice low but clear in the greenhouse silence. Elena startled, nearly knocking over the pot. "Julian, I didn't. You never come here." "I know." He took a few steps inside, hands in his pockets, looking around with genuine curiosity. "I wanted to see your world, the place where you spend all your time." His eyes traveled over the shelves full of orchids in various stages of growth, the misting systems, the grow lights carefully positioned. "It's like a sanctuary." "It is," she admitted, standing and wiping her hands on her apron. "It's the only place where I feel in control." Julian nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she'd said. He approached a phalaenopsis in full bloom, white petals with a delicate yellow center. "Can I?" he asked, extending his hand. "You can touch it," Elena said. "They're not as fragile as they look." He touched a petal with his index finger so gently he barely moved it. "Soft," he murmured, "like silk." His eyes met hers. "You have hands that create beauty, just like me. Only your medium is alive." Elena felt the flush rise up her cheeks. "What you create is art. What I do is just also art," Julian interrupted firmly. "Don't diminish it. There's artistry in knowing exactly what each living thing needs, in coaxing beauty from something that would wither without your care." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Yes, but in a different way, like static electricity before a storm. "I want to show you something," Julian said suddenly. "In my studio. Will you come?" Elena hesitated. She had never entered Julian's studio. It was his sacred space, just as the greenhouse was hers. Parallel worlds they inhabited separately. "Please," he added, and there was something vulnerable in the word. "I want you to see what I do, to understand." She nodded, removing her apron and following him across the property to the converted old stable. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone path, and she was hyper-aware of his proximity, the way their steps synchronized, how his arm occasionally brushed against hers. The studio door creaked as it opened, revealing the space she had only glimpsed from afar. The smell of metal and fire was more intense here, mixed with something oily and earthy. The forge in the center still radiated residual heat, coals glowing faintly. Tools covered every available surface, organized chaotically, but with a logic only Julian understood. But it was the sculptures that captured her attention. Dozens of them, in various stages of completion, abstract figures that somehow conveyed human emotion, metal spirals that seemed to capture movement, and flowers, so many flowers of iron and steel. Petals hammered so finely they seemed almost translucent. "Julian," she breathed, approaching an iron rose that captured perfectly the form of a real flower, each petal curving with impossible naturalness. "This is extraordinary. I'm glad you think so." He moved to a workbench in the corner where there was a shape covered by a cloth. "But this is what I really wanted to show you." He removed the cloth, revealing a block of wet clay, sculpting tools organized beside it. "I want to teach you something. If you're willing." "Teach me what?" "To sculpt." His eyes met hers, intense and serious. "You work with your hands to create. I want to show you how I work with mine." Elena approached slowly, studying the clay. It was dark, gray, smooth, waiting to be molded. "I don't know anything about sculpting. You know about form, about coaxing beauty from raw material." Julian was behind her now, so close she could feel his warmth against her back. "It's not so different." He took her hands gently, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and guided them to the clay. The material was cold and damp against her palms, sliding under her fingers. "Close your eyes," Julian whispered, his voice too close to her ear, his warm breath making the hairs on her neck stand up. Elena obeyed, darkness enveloping her vision, making every other sensation exponentially more intense. Julian's hands covered hers, his fingers interlacing with hers, guiding her. "Feel the clay," he murmured, his voice reverberating through her body where her back pressed against his chest. "It responds to pressure, to heat, to intention." He moved her hands over the clay, molding, pressing, creating depressions and elevations. His fingers were strong but surprisingly gentle, teaching hers to feel the material, to understand how it yielded and resisted. "How you can feel it transforming," he continued, his mouth so close to her ear that his lips lightly brushed the sensitive skin under your touch, becoming something new, something that didn't exist before. Elena could barely breathe. Every nerve ending in her body was on fire. She could feel every inch where his body touched hers, his chest against her back, his arms around hers, his thighs almost touching hers. The world had narrowed to this point of contact, to this intimate dance of hands over clay and synchronized breaths. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied. And she could hear the same tremor in his voice. "I feel it too." Their hands continued moving together, creating nameless forms, curves, and hollows that followed no conscious design, but somehow felt perfect. His breath was warm against her neck, accelerating in sync with hers. "Open your eyes," Julian murmured. Elena obeyed, blinking to adjust to the light. What they had created together was abstract, a form that suggested movement, emotion, union. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it was honest, raw. She turned, still within the circle of his arms, and suddenly their faces were inches apart. So close she could see golden flecks in his dark eyes, could count every lash, could feel every breath against her lips. Time stopped. The world went silent. There was only this, only the two of them, suspended in a moment of pure possibility. Julian raised a hand, still covered in clay, and touched her face, leaving a wet, cold mark on her cheek. His eyes asked a silent question, and for the first time, Elena didn't pull away, didn't say no, just waited, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. But then, Julian stepped back, just one step, but it was enough to break the spell. "Not yet," he said, his voice rough with effort. Not until you're sure, absolutely sure." Elena didn't trust her voice to respond. She just nodded, touching the place on her face where the clay had marked her skin, where his fingers had left their impression. As she walked back to the mansion minutes later, her hands still trembling, one truth crystallized in her mind with absolute clarity: she was no longer afraid of Julian Beaumont. She was beginning to desire him deeply, dangerously, and that frightened her much more. Derek Langford's arrival was like a stone thrown into still waters, creating ripples that expanded in ever-widening circles, disturbing the fragile peace that Elena and Julian had built. It was a Saturday afternoon when he appeared, driving a bright red convertible that seemed ridiculously out of place on the austere Beaumont property. Elena was in the front garden supervising the gardener as he installed new flower beds she had designed when she heard the cheerful honk and the sound of tires on gravel. She turned, shielding her eyes from the sun, and her heart sank when she recognized the driver. "Ellie!" Derek shouted, jumping from the car with the irrepressible energy she remembered all too well. He was exactly as he'd always been. Perfectly tousled blonde hair, toothpaste commercial smile, wearing expensive casual clothes that looked deliberately careless. "I can't believe I finally found you." "Derek," she said, forcing politeness into her voice as he approached. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" He laughed, that easy, confident laugh that used to make other girls sigh. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your number changed. Your parents wouldn't tell me where you were, and then I heard through the grapevine that you got married." He paused dramatically, looking around the property, to a Beaumont, no less. "Ellie, you dark horse, you..." Elena felt the flush of discomfort rise up her neck. Derek Langford had been part of her social circle before the marriage. Son of a wealthy family, always showing up at parties and charity events. He had flirted with her for years, never taking no for an answer, always assuming she'd eventually give in to his persistent charm. "Derek, I really don't think it's appropriate for you to be here." "Oh, come on," he interrupted, flashing that smile that probably worked on most women. "We're old friends. I just wanted to see how you're doing." Make sure this Beaumont guy is treating you right." He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I heard he's kind of intense, temperamental. You know, I always worried about you." "I'm fine," Elena said firmly, stepping back to create distance. "More than fine. And Julian is what?" The voice came from behind her, low, dangerous, carrying something that made the temperature drop several degrees. Elena turned to see Julian walking toward them from the studio, still wearing jeans and a black t-shirt stained with soot. His hair was disheveled, probably from running his hands through it while working, but it was his eyes that made Elena's stomach clench, dark, intense, fixed on Derek with an expression she'd never seen before, jealousy, pure and undisguised. "Julian," she began, but he walked past her without looking, positioning himself between her and Derek like a physical shield. "Who are you?" Julian asked, and though his voice was calm, there was an undercurrent of threat in it. Derek, either very brave or very stupid, extended his hand with that confident smile still on his face. "Derek Langford, old friend of Elena's. I was just in the area and thought I'd stop by to say hello." "No, you weren't." Julian cut him off, ignoring the extended hand. "You tracked down my wife's address and showed up uninvited. That's not being in the area. That's stalking." "Julian," Elena protested, mortified. "That's an overreaction." "Is it?" Julian finally looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes silenced her. "You told him to leave. I heard you. And yet he's still here." Derek raised his hands in a placating gesture, though the arrogance was still there beneath the surface. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Just wanted to check on an old friend." "She doesn't need you to check on her," Julian interrupted, taking another step closer to Derek, using his height and physical presence to intimidate. "She has me for that. Her husband—" "Right," Derek said slowly, finally reading the situation. "The husband? Got it." He looked over Julian's shoulder at Elena. "Ellie, if you ever need anything, she won't." Julian cut in again. "Because she has plans with me every night. Starting tonight." His eyes bore into Derek. "And every night after that. So whatever you were hoping for, forget it." The silence that followed was charged with palpable tension. Elena could feel the anger radiating from Julian in waves, could see the way his fists clenched at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to do something far more physical. "I should go," Derek finally said, backing toward his car. "Good to see you, Ellie. Congrats on the marriage." They watched in silence as he got into the convertible and drove away, tires spitting gravel in his haste to leave. The moment the car disappeared from view, Elena turned on Julian, anger replacing shock. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, crossing her arms. "Me protecting you from a guy who clearly can't accept that you're not interested?" Julian replied, his jaw still tight. "Protecting me?" Elena gave a humorless laugh. "You embarrassed me. You treated Derek like I was your property. He was hitting on you." Julian exploded, finally letting the anger leak out. "Right in front of our house. And you were being too polite, too accommodating." "I was being civilized," Elena shouted back. "Something you clearly don't know how to be. You can't just claim ownership over me like I'm one of your sculptures. That's not what I was doing, isn't it?" She took a step closer, meeting fire with fire, telling him, "I have plans with you every night, marking your territory." "I'm not yours, Julian. Not the way you were implying." Something flashed across his face, pain perhaps mixed with anger. "You're right," he said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You're not mine. Because even after everything, after the book, after the greenhouse, after the studio, you still pull back every time I get too close. You still flinch when I touch you. That's not fair, isn't it?" He threw her own words back. "I've been patient, Elena, so fucking patient, waiting for you to feel something, anything that isn't fear or obligation, watching you light up when you talk about flowers, but shut down every time I try to get closer, and then this guy shows up flirting with you, acting like he has some kind of claim. He doesn't." Elena interrupted, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "But neither do you." "Not really. This marriage was arranged, remember? Neither of us chose this." "I chose to try," Julian said, his voice breaking slightly. "I chose to respect your pace. I chose to." He stopped abruptly, running his hands over his face. "Forget it." Clearly, that wasn't enough. He turned to leave. "Julian, wait." Elena reached out, but he was already walking away. Shoulders tense, steps quick toward the studio. The door slammed behind him with a finality that echoed across the property. Elena stood alone in the garden, the sun still shining ironically on a day that had turned dark. The tears finally fell, hot and bitter. streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't being fair. She knew that Julian had been patient, had been thoughtful, had respected her boundaries even when she could see how much it cost him, and she had thrown it back in his face. That night, the mansion was quiet in a different way. Not the comfortable silence they'd developed, but something heavy and suffocating. Elena could hear the distant sound of metal being hammered. Bang, bang, bang. Julian, working his anger out at the forge as he always did, she lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The fight replaying in her mind, his words echoed. I chose to try. Clearly, that wasn't enough. She had heard him. She'd seen it in the way his voice broke, how his eyes closed for a fraction of a second before he turned away. And for the first time since the wedding, Elena asked herself, what did she really want? Did she want to continue this careful dance of closeness and distance? Or was she ready to take the next step? The sound of metal being hammered continued late into the night, a lonely, furious pulse that seemed to ask the same question she couldn't answer. 3 days passed in glacial silence. Julian didn't show up for breakfast, didn't cross paths with her in the hallways, didn't send messages through Mrs. Ellis. It was as if he had withdrawn completely. Taking refuge in the studio where the constant sound of metal being worked became the melancholic soundtrack of the mansion, Elena tried to focus on her orchids, but even her sanctuary felt empty without the possibility of him appearing. She hadn't realized how much she'd gotten used to his presence. The casual encounters, the glances that lasted a second too long, the electric tension that existed between them even when they weren't touching. And now nothing, just absence. It was Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Elena was in the greenhouse checking her plants as she did every afternoon when she noticed something extraordinary. The ghost orchid, Dendrobium lindonii, the rarest in her collection, the one that had stubbornly refused to bloom in the 2 years since she'd acquired it, was finally showing a bud. Not just any bud. It was the bud, ripe and about to open. Oh my God, she whispered, approaching with reverence. The ghost orchid bloomed only under perfect conditions, and its flowers lasted only a few days. Ethereal white petals that seemed to float in the air without visible support, hence the name Ghost. She had waited for this for so long. And now, finally that's when she heard the thunder. Elena looked up through the fogged glass of the greenhouse. The sky, which had been clear and blue all morning, had darkened dramatically. Black, heavy clouds were gathering on the horizon, moving too fast, laden with the promise of storm. Another clap of thunder, closer this time, and then she saw it. The first lightning bolt tearing across the sky like a wound. Her heart sank. The greenhouse had automatic ventilation systems that opened during heat. If the storm came with strong winds, if the panels opened, the rain and hail could— Oh no, she whispered, running to the control panel. Her fingers flew over the switches, trying to manually close the vents. But one of them was stuck, the rusted gear refusing to respond. The rain began, not gently, but all at once. As if someone had turned over a bucket in the sky, the wind howled, shaking the greenhouse glass, making the entire structure creak ominously. Elena pulled at the stuck vent with her hands, ignoring the rust cutting into her palms, but it wouldn't budge. Water began dripping through the opening, cold, heavy drops falling dangerously close to her most delicate orchids, especially close to the ghost orchid. Please, 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 she murmured, pulling with all her strength, tears of frustration, mixing with sweat, and the rain now coming in. The storm raged around her. The whole world reduced to water, wind, and desperation. And then, through the noise of the storm, she heard the greenhouse door burst open. Elena! Julian, drenched to the bone, hair plastered to his face, clothes stuck to his body. He must have run from the studio through the storm. The vent! She shouted over the sound of the rain. It's stuck, and the ghost orchid is going to. She didn't need to finish. Julian was beside her in 3 long strides, his hands covering hers on the stubborn vent. Together, they pulled once, twice, and on the 3rd try, the gear finally gave way with a metallic screech. The panel slammed shut, sealing the greenhouse against the storm. They both stood there panting, dripping water onto the concrete floor. The sound of rain hammering against the glass was deafening, but inside the greenhouse they were protected, safe and alone. You came, Elena said, still trying to catch her breath. Of course I came, Julian replied, his voice rough. Water dripped from his hair down his face, running along his strong jaw. I saw the storm. I knew you'd be here, worried about your flowers. Their eyes met, and Elena felt something break inside her. All the walls she had built, all the defenses she kept in place. He had run through a storm for her orchids, because he understood what they meant to her. "Julian, I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush. "For what I said about not being yours. I was scared and defensive." "Don't," he interrupted gently, raising his hand to touch her face, cold water from his fingers mixing with her warm tears. "You were right. I was possessive. I was." He stopped, his eyes darkening. "Seeing that guy looking at you, flirting, something inside me just snapped. The thought of you with someone else." His jaw tightened. "I couldn't take it." "There's no one else," Elena whispered. "Hasn't been. Not since." She stopped, realizing the truth of the words only as she said them. "Not since you." Julian's breath caught. "Elena, look," she interrupted, pointing to the ghost orchid. They turned together, still close enough that their shoulders touched, and there, as if responding to the emotional drama happening around it, the ghost orchid began to open. It was like watching a miracle in slow motion. The pure white petals unfolding, revealing the delicate center. The perfume, sweet, musky, hypnotic, filled the humid air of the greenhouse, mixing with the smell of rain and earth and something indefinable that was only theirs. "It's blooming," Elena breathed, amazed. "After 2 years, it's finally blooming." "Some things can't be forced," Julian said quietly, his eyes not on the flower, but on her. "They just need the right conditions, the right moment." Elena turned to look at him, and what she saw in his face took the air from her lungs. It wasn't just desire, though that was there, burning and undeniable. It was something deeper, more frightening, more real. "I get it now," she whispered. "Get what?" "Why you waited. Why you were so patient." Her hands moved to his face, fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Because this needs to be real, needs to be chosen, not forced, not rushed." Elena, her name on his lips was a prayer, a question, a plea, and then, for the first time, she was the one who closed the distance. Her lips met his, soft at first, tentative, like the first petal of a flower opening, but then Julian responded, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened, changed, transformed into something urgent and necessary. She could taste the rain on his lips, could feel the heat of his body through the soaked clothes, could hear the low sound he made when she pressed against him. Her hands moved up to his wet hair, fingers tangling in the dark strands, holding him close as the kiss continued, not gentle now, but hungry, as if they were trying to make up for all the days of distance, all the nights of repressed desire. Julian's hands slid down her back, down to her waist, fingers digging in slightly through the damp fabric. He turned her, pressing her gently against the workbench, and she arched against him, every point of contact sending sparks through her body. "God, Elena," he murmured against her lips, his voice wrecked. I've needed." "I know," she whispered back. "I know. Me, too." The kiss deepened even more. Their tongues met, teasing, exploring, learning the taste of each other. His hands slid under her wet shirt, calloused palms against the soft skin of her back, and she shivered, not from cold, not from fear, but from pure desire. Outside, the storm continued, rain hammering against the glass, thunder echoing like the heartbeat of the sky. But inside the greenhouse, wrapped in the perfume of the ghost orchid and each other's warmth, it was just them. Finally, completely, when they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, their foreheads touched. Julian cupped her face in his hands, thumbs stroking her wet cheeks. "Are you sure?" he asked, his dark eyes searching hers with fierce intensity. "Because if we go further, I don't know if I'll be able to stop." Elena smiled, small, intimate, just for him. "I don't want you to stop." She saw the impact of her words hit him, saw his eyes darken even more, saw the way his breath failed. "Then come with me," he said, voice rough with promise. He took her hand, fingers interlacing, palms pressing, and guided her out of the greenhouse back through the lessening rain toward the mansion. And this time, Elena didn't hesitate, didn't pull back, just followed him, heart pounding wildly, knowing that everything was about to change. They ran through the rain that now fell more gently, hands intertwined, steps synchronized. The Beaumont mansion rose before them, lit windows looking inviting after the storm. Elena could feel her heart pounding, not from fear, not from hesitation, but from anticipation, from certainty. Julian opened the front door, and they entered, dripping water onto the polished marble. "Mrs. Ellis appeared from the hallway, eyes widening at the state of them. Mr. Beaumont, Mrs. Beaumont, you're soaked. Let me get towels. We're fine, Mrs. Ellis, Julian said, his voice rough but firm. His eyes never left Elena. Actually, we don't want to be disturbed. For the rest of the night, the housekeeper understood immediately, a small smile touching her lips. Of course, sir. I'll make sure of it. She disappeared discreetly, and then it was just silence. Just Elena and Julian in the grand entrance hall, water dripping from them, the tension between them so palpable the air seemed to vibrate. Elena, Julian said quietly, taking a step closer, last chance. If you want to go back, if you need more time. She silenced him by placing her fingers over his lips. I'm done waiting, she whispered. I'm done being scared. I want this. I want you. Something broke inside him. She could see it. The last strip of careful control disintegrating, his eyes darkened, burning with an intensity that set every nerve in her body alight. He picked her up without warning, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. Elena let out a small cry of surprise, her hands automatically circling his neck. Julian, I've waited long enough to carry you across this threshold, he murmured, beginning to climb the wide staircase toward the second floor. Not letting the moment pass, she laughed, a genuine sound of joy that echoed through the empty hall. He carried her through the familiar corridors, past her room, until they reached the bridal suite that had remained untouched since that first night weeks ago. Julian pushed the door open with his shoulder, entering and kicking it closed behind them. He set her gently on her feet, but didn't release her. One hand still at her waist, the other rising to comb through her wet hair. You're shaking, he observed, concern crossing his face. Not from cold, Elena admitted, from anticipation. A slow, dangerously seductive smile spread across his face. Good, he murmured, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her forehead. Because I plan to make this worth every second you waited. His hands found the hem of her wet shirt, fingers brushing the exposed skin of her waist. Can I? He asked, always giving her choice, always making sure. Yes, she whispered. He lifted the shirt slowly, reverently, revealing inch by inch of pale skin. When the fabric passed over her head, he let it fall to the floor without looking. His eyes were fixed on her, on the curve of her shoulders, the line of her neck, the way she trembled under his gaze. Beautiful, Julian breathed. So fucking beautiful. Elena felt the blush spread across her chest, but didn't pull away. Instead, with hands trembling only slightly as she reached for the button of his wet shirt, Your turn. He stood still, letting her work, watching her face as she unbuttoned each button slowly. When she finished, she pushed the shirt from his broad shoulders, revealing the body she had only glimpsed before, muscles defined by physical work at the forge, bronzed skin marked with small scars that told stories of hot iron and sharp metal. Her fingers traced a particular scar near his heart. How did this happen? Distracted, Julian admitted, capturing her hand and bringing it to his lips. Thinking about you when I should have been paying attention to molten metal. He kissed each of her fingers. You've been distracting me since the moment I saw you. He guided her gently toward the enormous bed, the same one where they had separated that first night. But now everything was different. Now it was choice. It was desire. It was love. Even if neither had said the words yet, Julian sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her to stand between his legs. His hands slid along the curve of her waist, thumbs tracing patterns on sensitive skin. Are you sure? He asked one last time, eyes searching hers. Absolutely sure? Elena answered by leaning down and capturing his lips in a kiss that left no doubt. Deep, urgent, full of promise, her hands slid over his shoulders, fingers exploring every muscle, every line of his body she had wanted to touch for weeks. Julian groaned against her mouth, hands tightening on her waist before sliding down to the waist of her wet pants. These need to go, he murmured against her lips. With efficient but gentle movements, he removed the rest of her wet clothes, revealing her completely. Elena felt a pulse of vulnerability. But the way he looked at her with something close to reverence, to adoration, made any insecurity disappear. Perfect, he whispered, laying her gently on the bed, covering her body with his. You're perfect. His weight on her was delicious, solid, warm, real. She arched against him, feeling every inch where their bodies touched. Her hands explored his back, feeling the muscles flex under her fingers. Julian kissed a slow path from her mouth to her jaw down her neck. Each kiss was a promise, each touch a discovery. When his lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, she arched, a low sound escaping her throat. I love that sound. he murmured against her skin, smiling against it. Want to hear it again? His hands, calloused but surprisingly gentle, explored her body with reverence, tracing curves, memorizing every inch, learning what made her tremble, what made her sigh, what made her say his name in a broken whisper. Julian, Elena whispered, her own hands sliding down the broad expanse of his back. Please, please. What? He asked, lifting his head to look at her. His eyes were dark, burning with desire, but also with tenderness. Tell me what you need. You, she said simply, just you. He captured her lips again, the kiss deepening as finally they joined completely. Elena felt a moment of discomfort that quickly transformed into something different, something complete, something right. Julian stayed still, trembling with the effort of control, allowing her to adjust. Okay? He asked, voice strained. Yes, she breathed, moving her hips experimentally. Yes, please move. And he obeyed, establishing a rhythm that was gentle at first, allowing her to get used to it, but gradually building. Their bodies moved together, meeting, separating, reuniting in a dance as old as time, but new to them. Elena. Julian gasped against her neck, his breath hot and fast. God, you feel I know, she whispered, holding him closer, her fingers digging into his back. I know. The pleasure built in waves, slow at first, then faster, more intense, until Elena felt something breaking inside her. Waves of sensation washing through her entire body. She cried out his name, clinging to him like an anchor as the world came apart and reassembled itself. Julian followed moments later, his body tensing, a guttural sound escaping his throat as he held her so tight she could barely breathe. But she didn't care. She wanted to be this close. She wanted to feel his heart beating against hers. She wanted this moment etched in her memory forever. Afterward, wrapped in soft sheets, their bodies still intertwined, Elena laid her head against his chest. She could hear his heart still beating fast, gradually slowing to a calmer rhythm. Her fingers traced lazy patterns on his skin. Memorizing the feeling, Julian pressed a kiss to her hair, his hands caressing her back in long, soothing strokes. I've loved you for so long, Elena, he confessed quietly, the vulnerability in his voice making her look up. Since before the wedding, since I saw you at that charity gala a year ago. You were wearing a blue dress, laughing with friends, and I couldn't look away. Tears stung her eyes. You never said, how could I? He smiled sadly. You barely knew me. And when my mother arranged the marriage, I thought, maybe this is my chance to make you see me, to make you feel anything beyond obligation. Julian, Elena whispered, cupping his face in her hands. I was so scared of you, of this, of feeling anything. But now, she paused, gathering courage. Now I love you too. She saw the impact of her words hit him, the way his eyes widened, how his breath caught, how a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. Say it again, he asked, turning them so she was on top of him. I love you, Elena repeated, smiling through tears. I love you, Julian Beaumont. He pulled her down, kissing her deeply, and she could feel his smile against her lips, could feel the joy radiating from him in waves. And when they made love again, slower this time, savoring each moment, each touch, it was with the certainty that this was only the beginning. Morning arrived soft and golden through the curtains of the bridal suite. Elena woke wrapped in warmth, strong arms around her, steady breathing against her neck, Julian's scent enveloping her like an invisible blanket. For a moment, she just lay there, absorbing the feeling of being so completely intertwined with another person. You're awake, Julian murmured against her hair, his voice rough with sleep. How did you know? Your breathing changed. He turned her gently so he could see her, his dark eyes softened by the morning light. Morning, she replied, feeling a blush rise up her cheeks as she remembered the night before. Everything, each intimate moment, each whispered word, each touch that had transformed her. Julian smiled. That slow, devastating smile she was learning was reserved just for her. Don't get shy on me now, he teased gently, tracing the outline of her cheek with his thumb. Not after last night. I'm not shy, Elena protested, but buried her face in his chest anyway, making him laugh, a deep, rich sound that reverberated through her. They stayed like this for a long time, simply existing together. Fingers intertwined, hearts synchronized. The outside world could wait. This moment, this perfect lazy moment, belonged only to them. It was only when the sun climbed higher that Julian finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of nervousness she rarely heard from him. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Something important, but only if you're ready." Elena lifted her head, studying his face. There was vulnerability there, the kind he rarely let show. "Show me," she said simply. After getting dressed, Elena in comfortable clothes, Julian in his usual uniform of jeans and t-shirt, they walked across the property toward the studio. But instead of entering through the main door as she expected, Julian guided her around the building to a side she'd never explored. There was a smaller door there, almost hidden by vines growing up the brick wall. Julian pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended to what must be a basement or cellar. "Careful," he said, taking her hand as they began to descend. "The steps are steep." The staircase led to a short corridor lit only by the dim light of a single bulb. At the end of the corridor, another door, this one of heavy wood with an old lock. Julian stopped in front of it, the key already in his hand, but he didn't insert it immediately. Instead, he turned to Elena, and she could see the anxiety in his eyes. "What I'm about to show you," he began, "nobody else knows about. Not Lucas. Not my mother. No one. It's the most honest part of me. The part I guard because—" He stopped, searching for words. "Because it's where I keep everything I can't say out loud." "Julian," Elena said gently, squeezing his hand, "you don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted. "I need to, because if we're doing this, if we're really building something together, I want you to see all of me, even the parts that are intense, obsessive. Maybe—" He unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly. What was revealed took the air from Elena's lungs. It was a studio, small, intimate, lit by strategically positioned lamps that created dramatic shadows, but it wasn't the lamps or the space that left her speechless. It was the sculpture. In the center of the room, on a pedestal of black marble, stood a life-sized female figure made of polished bronze that captured and reflected light in soft waves. And the face, "Oh my God," Elena whispered, approaching slowly. That's me." It was, every detail captured with impossible precision. The curve of her cheeks, the shape of her lips, the exact angle of her nose. But it wasn't just technically perfect, it was emotional. The expression on the statue's face was one of serene contemplation, eyes slightly lowered as if observing something precious in her hands. And in her hands, also captured in bronze, were orchids. Delicate metal flowers, so finely worked, they looked real, each petal individual, each stamen visible. When Elena began, but her voice failed, tears were already streaming down her cheeks. "I started a year ago," Julian admitted, "coming up behind her after that gala. Couldn't get you out of my head. So, I made this, spent months on the piece, working from memory, from sketches I made whenever I saw you at events." He paused. "I made this when all I had was dreams of you. When I thought you'd never be mine." Elena circled the sculpture slowly, absorbing every detail, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, the graceful posture, and the orchids. God, the orchids were so realistic she could almost smell their perfume. "You knew," she said quietly, turning to look at him, "about my love for orchids. Before the marriage, you already knew." Julian nodded. "I may have paid attention, asked around, discovered that you volunteered at the botanical garden, that you spent hours in your family's greenhouse." He ran his hand through his hair. A nervous gesture. "I know how this sounds obsessive, creepy. Maybe—" "It's not," Elena interrupted, closing the distance between them. Her hands found his face, forcing him to look at her. It's the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me." "Yeah?" There was hope in his voice, raw vulnerability. "Yeah." She rose on her tiptoes, kissing him softly. "You saw me, really saw me. Before I even knew you existed, you were paying attention, caring." She turned back to the sculpture, studying it again. There were other details she hadn't initially noticed. Small metal butterflies perched on the orchids. So delicate it was hard to believe they'd been forged. The fabric of the figure's dress seemed to flow, frozen in eternal movement. "The dress," she said, recognizing it. "This is what I was wearing at the gala." "Blue silk," Julian confirmed, "with that back, that nearly killed me." Elena laughed through tears. "For you remember the dress." "I remember everything about that night," he said, coming to stand beside her. "How you laughed, how you touched that white orchid in the centerpiece like it was sacred, how you left early because you were tired of people not really listening when you spoke." He took her hand. "I wanted to be someone who listened, someone who saw you." "And you are," Elena whispered. "You are." She looked around the room, noticing other works, drawings pinned to the walls, some of them studies of her hands, her profile, her smile. There were notebooks stacked on a table, probably full of more sketches. "How many hours did you spend here?" she asked. "Too many to count," Julian admitted. "This place, it became my sanctuary, where I could feel close to you, even when you were pushing me away after we got married. After that first night when you said you couldn't, I'd come here, work on the piece, tell the statue things I couldn't tell you." "Like what?" He looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her forget to breathe. "Like how desperately I wanted you to be happy. Like how every time you smiled at something, anything, my whole day got better. Like how I'd lie awake at night knowing you were just down the hall, so close but so far. And it was torture." Elena felt fresh tears falling. "Julian, like how I fell in love with you more and more every day," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "watching you with your flowers, hearing you laugh genuinely for the first time, seeing you defend yourself against my mother. Every small thing you did made me love you more, and I didn't know how to tell you without scaring you away." "You're telling me now," she whispered. "Because now you're here," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Because now I don't have to just dream. Because now you're real. You're mine, and I'm yours completely." Elena buried her face in his chest, feeling her tears wet his shirt. "I'm sorry it took so long for me. Don't be sorry," he interrupted, kissing the top of her head. "You needed time. And I'd wait a lifetime if that's what it took." They stood like that for a long time, held in each other's arms in the secret sanctuary where Julian's devotion had been preserved in bronze and metal. The sculpture watched serenely, silent witness to a love that had begun as a dream and was now gloriously, perfectly real. "Can I?" Elena began hesitantly. "Can I come here sometimes to see her?" "Me?" "This place is yours now," Julian said. "Everything I am, everything I have, it's all yours, Elena. Always was. You just didn't know it yet." She looked up, capturing his lips in a kiss that communicated everything words couldn't: gratitude, love, admiration, and the promise that she would never again doubt how deeply she was loved. When they finally left the secret studio, climbing back up to daylight, something fundamental had changed. There were no more secrets between them, no more walls, just naked truth and love exposed in its purest form, and it was more beautiful than any sculpture could capture. The Beaumont property garden had transformed into something extraordinary. Where there had once been only formal lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges, there now existed a botanical paradise. Curved beds filled with hybrid orchids that Elena had developed over the year, stone paths that wound between flowering trees. And in the center of it all, like a precious jewel, the bronze sculpture. It had been moved from the secret studio to the garden 6 months ago at Julian's insistence. "The world deserves to see this," he had said. "See you. See what I see." And now, in the golden light of a spring afternoon, the statue of Elena gleamed softly, the metal orchids in her hands reflecting the sun as if they were alive. Around its base, Elena had planted real orchids, hybrids she had created specifically for this place, flowers that combined the hardiness of native species with the exotic beauty of tropical varieties, fire and flower, strength and delicacy, just like them. Elena was on her knees beside a new bed, her hands buried in rich dark soil, but her movements were slower now, more careful because she was no longer alone in her body. At 8 months pregnant, her belly was prominent and round. Stretching the floral cotton dress she wore, she had stopped trying to hide it months ago. Now she embraced it, marveling at the miracle growing inside her. "You shouldn't be kneeling," came Julian's familiar voice, carrying that mixture of concern and affectionate exasperation she knew so well now. Elena looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun to see him approaching. He wore worn jeans and a gray t-shirt stained with soot, evidently coming straight from the studio. His hair was disheveled, probably from running his hands through it while working, and there was a smudge of grease on his cheek. "I'm planting the last cattleya," she protested, but let him help her up, groaning slightly. When her back protested, "It had to be today. The moon is right, and our son needs his mother not to kill herself working," Julian interrupted. But there was affection in his voice. His hands went automatically to her belly, large calloused palms spreading over the curve. "Hey, buddy, your mom is being stubborn again." As if in response, the baby kicked hard enough for them both to feel it under Julian's palms. His eyes widened, that expression of wonder that appeared every time he felt his son move. "He kicks like his father," Elena laughed, covering his hands with hers. "He'll forge his own world," Julian replied. leaning down to kiss her forehead, then her nose. Then finally, her lips. Soft and sweet. When he pulled back, he studied her face with that intensity that had never diminished, not even after a year of marriage. "You look tired. Come rest." "I'm fine, Elena." His voice was firm, but gentle. "Please for me," she sighed, knowing she had lost. "Fine." But only for an hour. Julian guided her to a garden bench, strategically positioned with a view of the entire property, the renovated greenhouse on the left, the studio on the right, and between them, their hybrid garden that represented everything they had built together. He sat first, then gently pulled her to sit between his legs, her back resting against his chest. His arms circled her belly, hands resting protectively over where their son was growing. "Remember when we couldn't even be in the same room without tension?" Elena murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I remember every second," Julian replied, his chin resting on top of her head. "Remember that first night when you said you couldn't, and I promised we'd go slowly." "Best promise you ever made," she said, turning slightly to kiss his jaw, "even though it nearly killed both of us." He laughed, the sound reverberating through her. "Worth it. Every agonizing moment was worth it to get here, to have this." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the garden. A butterfly landed on one of the nearby orchids, a hybrid phalaenopsis with petals that gradually changed from white to deep pink, one of Elena's experiments that had worked perfectly. "Your mother called today," Elena mentioned casually. She felt Julian stiffen slightly behind her. And she wants to visit to meet her grandson." Elena paused. "I said she could, but only if she promised to behave." Julian was quiet for a long moment. The relationship with Lillian had been tense since that confrontation a year ago. There had been occasional attempts at reconciliation, usually initiated by Lillian with reluctance and barely disguised pride. But since they'd learned about the pregnancy, something had changed. Her calls had become more frequent, her voice carrying something that almost seemed like regret. "If you're comfortable with it," Julian finally said, "then yes, she can come. But the first sign she crosses a line." "You'll defend me fiercely," Elena completed, smiling. "I know. My fierce protector. Always," he confirmed, kissing her neck. "You and this little guy, you're my whole world." "Anything or anyone that threatens that I know," she interrupted gently. "I know, love." The baby kicked again, harder this time. Julian moved his hands, following the movement under Elena's skin. "He's strong," he observed with admiration. "Takes after his father," Elena replied. "All that forging and hammering, it's in his blood now. And his love for beauty," Julian added. "That's from you, from watching you with flowers. Seeing how you coax life from things others would give up on." Elena turned more fully in his arms, facing him now, though it was an awkward maneuver with her belly between them. "We made something incredible, didn't we?" she whispered, her hands circling his neck. "Not just him, but us. This whole life." "We did," Julian agreed, his hands framing her face with a reverence that had never diminished. "From that disastrous first night to this, to love to family to." He was interrupted by a sharp cry coming from the greenhouse. "Mrs. Ellis appeared at the door, waving frantically. "Mrs. Beaumont. Mr. Beaumont. The ghost orchid. It's blooming again." Elena and Julian exchanged a look, that look of instant communication that couples develop, and then they were both moving, him helping her carefully to her feet, then walking quickly, as quickly as she could at 8 months pregnant, toward the greenhouse. The ghost orchid had bloomed only that one time during the storm a year ago. Elena had tried to replicate the conditions, but the plant had remained stubbornly dormant since then, until now. Inside the greenhouse, the perfectly controlled temperature, the humidity at the exact level, the filtered light, the ghost orchid was opening not one but 3 flowers. Pure white petals unfolding like ethereal spirits, the sweet musky perfume filling the air. "Oh," Elena breathed, tears instantly welling up. Damn pregnancy hormones, making her cry at everything lately. Julian was behind her, arms around her, and together they watched the miracle unfold. The 3 flowers opening simultaneously, perfect and impossible. 3, Elena whispered, "1 for each of us." Julian kissed her neck, his hands resting on her belly where their son continued his acrobatics. "Our family," he murmured. "Complete." "Not quite yet," Elena corrected, covering his hands with hers. "1 more month and then everything changes." Julian finished again. "Scared?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted honestly, "of not being good enough, of not knowing what to do, of being exactly like your father." Elena interrupted gently, turning to look at him. He nodded, raw vulnerability in his eyes. "You won't be," she said firmly, "because you're already different. You choose kindness. You choose patience. You choose love." She held his face. "You chose me every day. You choose me. And you'll choose him, too. Always." Julian pulled her into a hug, awkward with the belly between them, but perfect anyway. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured into her hair. "We both did," Elena replied. "We both got lucky." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in the perfume of ghost orchids, their hearts beating in sync, their son occasionally kicking as if to remind them of his presence. And as the sun descended, casting long shadows through the greenhouse, Elena thought about everything that had brought them here: the interrupted wedding night, the weeks of careful dancing, the book, the confrontation, the studio, the storm, the surrender, the secret sculpture. Every moment had been necessary. Every step, no matter how hesitant, had brought them to this perfect place, where fire met flower, where strength embraced delicacy, where two strangers had become everything to each other. "I love you," Elena whispered. "I love you," Julian echoed. "Forever." And in the soft light of the greenhouse, with ghost orchids blooming around them and new life growing between them, they sealed their promise with a kiss, a beginning disguised as an ending, a family forged slowly with patience and love, perfect in its imperfection. Theirs, completely theirs. Sometimes the most beautiful stories don't begin with love at first sight. They begin with fear, with hesitation, with two souls who need to learn not just to love each other, but to trust the rhythm of their own hearts. Elena and Julian teach us that going slowly isn't weakness, it's wisdom, that respecting someone's boundaries is the deepest form of love, that sometimes the most powerful promises are those whispered in darkness when all we have is faith that the other will wait. They transformed an arranged marriage into a work of art. They forged love where there was only obligation. And they proved that when two people choose every day to be together, not by contract but by desire, they create something that neither the most intense fire can destroy, nor the most delicate flower can surpass. And you, when was the last time you allowed something or someone to grow in their own time, when you respected the natural rhythm of beautiful things? Maybe deep down this story speaks to us too, about how we all deserve someone who says, "I'll go slow. I'll wait because you're worth every second."